They called my art collection frivolous. My weekly pottery classes? A waste of time and money. The vintage furniture I carefully restored? Throwing good money after bad. My family had opinions about every dollar I spent, every hobby I pursued, every choice I made with my own hard-earned money. They said I was being irresponsible, that I should be more practical, more sensible. They never said it directly, but I knew what they really meant. They were watching my bank account, waiting for their inheritance, and every purchase I made felt like money stolen from their future. So when they finally came asking for that money, when they needed it for their practical investments and sensible business ventures, they discovered that all those wasteful purchases had been moved somewhere they'd never find them. Somewhere safe. Somewhere protected by a woman who had learned that the people who criticize your joy are usually the ones planning to profit from your sacrifice. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Andrea Wilson, and at 58, I had finally reached the point in my life where I thought I could spend my money however I pleased. I lived in a cozy craftsman-style house in Portland, Oregon, with hardwood floors that creaked in just the right places and windows that caught the morning light like prisms. The house sat on a quiet street lined with maple trees, and in the fall my front yard became a carpet of gold and crimson leaves that I never rushed to rake up. I had worked as a senior graphic designer for an advertising agency for 32 years, climbing my way up from junior layout artist to creative director. Those decades had been filled with late nights, tight deadlines, and the constant pressure to make other people's visions come to life. I designed campaigns for products I'd never use, created logos for companies whose values I didn't share, and spent countless hours in meetings where my ideas were dissected, rebuilt, and often unrecognizable by the time they reached the public. But the work had paid well. Very well. And more importantly, I had been smart with that money. I lived modestly during my working years, not because I had to, but because I was planning for something bigger. I maxed out my 401k every year, invested in a diversified portfolio, and maintained an emergency fund that could have covered 3 years of expenses. I owned my house outright, having paid off the mortgage 8 years early. I drove a reliable Honda Accord that I maintained meticulously and replaced only when absolutely necessary. By the time I took early retirement at 55, I had accumulated what most people would consider a substantial nest egg. Not wealthy by billionaire standards, but comfortable enough that I could pursue the interests I had postponed for 3 decades while building my career. For the first time in my adult life, I could spend money on things that brought me joy rather than just necessity. And that's when I discovered pottery. It started innocently enough. A friend had dragged me to a weekend workshop at a local arts center, insisting I needed a hobby that didn't involve a computer screen. I expected to hate it. My hands had spent so many years manipulating a mouse and keyboard that I assumed they'd forgotten how to create anything tangible. But when I sat down at that pottery wheel for the first time, when I felt the clay respond to my touch, something awakened in me that I didn't even know had been sleeping. The clay didn't argue with my creative decisions. It didn't need focus groups or client approval. It became what I shaped it to become, and if I didn't like the result, I could simply collapse it and start over. There was something profoundly satisfying about creating something beautiful with my hands, something that existed in the physical world rather than just on a screen. I enrolled in regular classes. Tuesday evenings and Saturday mornings became sacred time, 2-hour blocks where I lost myself completely in the rhythm of the wheel, the texture of the clay, the quiet concentration required to center a piece and coax it into the shape I envisioned. I wasn't particularly talented at first. My early bowls were lopsided. My vases looked more like abstract sculptures than functional vessels. But I was improving, and more importantly, I was happy. After 6 months, I converted my garage into a proper studio. I bought a professional-grade pottery wheel, a kiln, shelving for drying pieces, and all the glazes and tools a serious ceramicist might need. The investment was significant, nearly $15,000, but I could afford it, and it brought me a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since my early days in graphic design, when everything was new and exciting. My family's reaction was swift and predictable. Haas. My younger brother Marcus was the first to comment. During a family barbecue at my sister Diane's house, he wandered into my garage studio and let out a low whistle as he surveyed the equipment. "Jesus, Andrea," he said, running his hand along the smooth surface of my pottery wheel. "This setup probably cost more than most people's cars. Seems like a pretty expensive hobby for someone who's supposed to be saving for retirement." I explained that I was already retired, that my savings were more than adequate, and that this was exactly what I had been saving for, the freedom to pursue my interests without worrying about the cost. Marcus just shrugged and muttered something about different priorities, but I could see the judgment in his eyes. He was a practical man who worked in construction management, and to him, money spent on anything that didn't appreciate in value or serve a clear functional purpose was money wasted. Diane was more direct in her criticism. She visited my studio a few weeks later, ostensibly to see what I was working on, but I could tell she was really there to assess the scope of my spending problem. She picked up one of my finished pieces, a celadon glazed bowl that one was particularly proud of, and turned it over to examine the bottom. "It's pretty," she said in the tone people use when they're about to deliver a criticism disguised as concern. "But you could probably buy something just like this at Target for $20. How much did it cost you to make?" I tried to explain that the value wasn't just in the finished product, that the process itself was what mattered, that the time I spent creating was an investment in my mental health and creative fulfillment. But Diane was a real estate agent who measured everything in terms of return on investment, and she couldn't understand spending money on something that wouldn't eventually pay for itself. "I'm just worried about you," she said, setting the bowl down carefully. "You're being so frivolous with your money. What happens if you have a medical emergency? What if the market crashes and your investments lose value? You're spending like you have unlimited resources, but none of us do." The criticism stung, but not because I thought she was right. It stung because I recognized the underlying assumption, that my money wasn't really mine to spend as I chose, that I had some obligation to preserve it for purposes other than my own happiness. There was an implication that my choices affected them somehow, though none of them had ever explained exactly how. My nephew Tyler was even more blunt during a family dinner at my house. He was 26, fresh out of business school, and full of opinions about financial responsibility. He walked through my living room, noting the restored mid-century modern furniture I had been collecting, the original artwork I had purchased from local artists, the hand-thrown pottery that filled my shelves. "Aunt Andrea," he said with the confidence of someone who had never actually managed significant wealth, "you know all this stuff is just going to depreciate, right? You're basically burning money. If you invested what you've spent on all this decorative stuff in index funds, you'd probably double your retirement savings in 10 years. I pointed out that my retirement savings were already more than adequate, that I had run detailed projections with a financial advisor, and that every purchase I made was well within my means. But Tyler just shook his head like I was a child who didn't understand basic mathematics. "It's not about whether you can afford it now," he said. "It's about opportunity cost. Every dollar you spend on pottery classes or vintage furniture is a dollar that's not growing in the market. You're leaving money on the table." The phrase, "leaving money on the table," became a recurring theme in family conversations. If I mentioned taking a ceramics workshop in Santa Fe, someone would point out that the money could have been invested instead. If I bought a piece of handmade furniture from a local craftsman, someone would calculate how much that money would be worth in 20 years if it were earning compound interest. They weren't wrong about the mathematics. Every dollar I spent on my hobbies and interests was indeed a dollar that wasn't earning investment returns. But they were missing something fundamental. I wasn't trying to maximize my wealth. I was trying to maximize my life. I had spent 32 years optimizing for financial security, postponing purchases and experiences because building wealth seemed more important than enjoying it. I had accumulated enough money to last the rest of my life comfortably, even accounting for inflation and potential market downturns. The question that my family couldn't seem to grasp was simple. What was the point of having money if you never spent it on anything that brought you joy? But their criticism was relentless and consistent. Every family gathering became an opportunity for someone to comment on my spending habits. They spoke about my purchases the way other families might discuss a relative's drinking problem, with a mixture of concern and disapproval that suggested I was making choices that affected everyone, not just myself. What I didn't realize at the time was that their concern wasn't really about my financial well-being, it was about theirs. I was single, with no children, and in their minds that made me the family bank. They had gotten used to the idea that my accumulated wealth would eventually be distributed among them, and every dollar I spent on pottery or furniture or art was a dollar that wouldn't be part of that inheritance. They never said this directly, of course. The criticism was always framed in terms of my own best interests, my own financial security, my own future needs. But the subtext was clear. I was being selfish with money that they had already mentally claimed as their own. And that subtext was about to become text when they finally worked up the courage to ask for what they really wanted. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The turning point came on a rainy Thursday morning in March when I decided to expand my art collection. I had been following the work of a local sculptor named Elena Vasquez for months, admiring her bronze pieces that captured the fluid movement of dancers frozen in time. When her gallery announced a solo exhibition featuring a new series called Metamorphosis, I knew I had to see it. The gallery was quiet that morning, with only a few other visitors wandering through the space. Elena's new pieces were even more stunning in person. Each sculpture seemed to breathe with its own energy, the bronze surfaces catching and reflecting the overhead lighting in ways that made them appear almost alive. I spent nearly 2 hours studying each piece, taking notes in the small leather journal I always carried, sketching rough impressions of the forms that spoke to me most powerfully. One piece in particular captured my attention completely. It was called Emergence, a medium-sized bronze figure of a woman breaking free from what appeared to be a cocoon or shell. The artist had managed to convey both struggle and triumph in the piece. The figure's face showed determination rather than pain, and her hands, just beginning to emerge, were reaching upward rather than grasping desperately. There was something about the sculpture that reminded me of my own recent transformation from corporate designer to independent artist. The price was substantial, $18,000. For most people, that would represent months of salary, a down payment on a car, or a significant portion of their annual savings. For me, it represented about 2% of my liquid assets, money I could spend without affecting my financial security in any meaningful way. But more than that, it represented something I genuinely wanted to live with, to see every day, to be inspired by for years to come. I spoke with the gallery owner about payment arrangements and delivery logistics. The piece would need to be professionally installed due to its weight and the specific lighting requirements to show it properly. I would need to have an electrician add track lighting in my living room and possibly reinforce the floor where it would sit. All told, the complete project would cost around $25,000. I wrote the check that afternoon. That evening, I called Diane to share my excitement about the acquisition. I described Elena's work, the power of the Emergence piece, and my plans for displaying it in my home. I talked about how the sculpture would complement the other pieces in my collection, and how much I was looking forward to living with it every day. The silence on the other end of the phone lasted so long that I wondered if the call had dropped. "Andrea," Diane finally said, and I could hear something in her voice that I'd never heard before. Not just disapproval, but genuine shock. "Did you just say you spent $18,000 on a sculpture, plus another $7,000 to install it properly?" I confirmed that I had, explaining again how much the piece meant to me and how carefully I had considered the purchase. I mentioned that I had been following Elena's work for months, that this wasn't an impulse buy, and that the price was well within my budget. "Your budget?" Diane's voice rose an octave. "Andrea, that's more than some people make in 6 months, for a piece of metal that's just gonna sit in your living room. You could have bought a car with that money. You could have taken a cruise around the world. You could have—" She stopped herself, but I knew what she was thinking. "You could have saved it for us." I tried to explain the difference between cost and value, how art appreciation worked, why supporting living artists mattered to me, but Diane wasn't listening to understand. She was listening to judge. Every word I said seemed to confirm her worst fears about my financial decision-making. "This has gotten completely out of hand," she said finally. "The pottery was one thing. At least that was a hobby, something you could learn from. But this is just showing off. This is just wasteful." That word again, wasteful. As if my choices about how to spend my own money were somehow morally deficient. As if finding joy in beautiful objects was a character flaw rather than a personal preference. The conversation ended awkwardly, with Diane saying she needed to think about what she'd heard. She didn't say goodbye so much as hang up while making vague noises about calling me back later. But I knew she wouldn't be calling me. She'd be calling Marcus and Tyler, and probably our cousin Sarah, to discuss what they were now undoubtedly thinking of as the Andrea situation. I was right. The next morning, my phone started ringing before 8 o'clock. Marcus was first. "Diane told me about your latest purchase," he said without preamble. "Andrea, I need to ask you something directly. Are you having some kind of midlife crisis? Because this spending pattern isn't normal. It's not responsible." He had clearly prepared for this conversation because he had numbers ready. He had calculated how much I had spent on art, pottery equipment, furniture, and classes over the past 3 years. The total was significant, nearly $80,000. Though he was including things like my pottery wheel and kiln as single purchases, rather than amortizing them over the years of use I would get from them. "That's more than most people's annual salary," he said. "And for what? Hobbies? Decorations? Andrea, you're 58 years old. You need to start thinking about your future, about what happens when you need long-term care, about what happens if your investments don't perform as well as you expect." I pointed out that I had already thought about those things extensively, that I had long-term care insurance, that my investment portfolio was conservatively managed and stress-tested for various market scenarios. But Marcus wasn't interested in the details of my financial planning. He was interested in making me feel irresponsible for spending money on things that brought me happiness. Tyler called 2 hours later. His approach was different, less emotional, more analytical, but ultimately more condescending. He had apparently spent the morning researching art market trends and was ready to explain why my purchases were not just expensive but stupid. "Aunt Andrea, I looked up this Elena Vasquez artist online," he said. "Her pieces have never sold at auction, which means there's no established secondary market for her work. You're essentially gambling on an unproven asset. If you wanted to invest in art, you should be looking at established artists with track records of appreciation." I tried to explain that I wasn't buying art as an investment, that I was buying it because I loved it, because it enhanced my daily life, because supporting living artists was important to me. But Tyler couldn't seem to grasp the concept of purchasing something for reasons other than financial return. "That's exactly the problem," he said. "You're making emotional decisions with serious money. You're letting your feelings override your financial judgment. At your age, every dollar should be working for you, not just sitting there looking pretty." The phrase "at your age" stung more than I expected. Tyler was suggesting that 58 was too old for passion projects, too old for discovering new interests, too old for spending money on anything other than the most practical necessities. In his view, I had reached an age where my job was to preserve wealth rather than enjoy it. But the call that really got to me came from Sarah, my cousin who lived in Denver. We had always been close. She was only 3 years younger than me, and we had grown up more like sisters than cousins. I expected her to understand my perspective, or at least to approach the topic with more nuance than my immediate family had shown. Instead, she was the most direct about what everyone was really thinking. "Andrea, honey, I'm worried about you," she said in the gentle voice people use when they're about to say something harsh. "All this spending, it's like you're trying to spend your money before someone else can get their hands on it. But the thing is, we're not strangers, we're your family. When you're gone, that money is going to come to us anyway. So when you spend it on these expensive hobbies and art pieces, you're essentially taking it away from people who could really use it." There it was. The subtext had become text. Sarah was saying explicitly what the others had only implied. My money wasn't really mine to spend because they were counting on inheriting it. In their minds, every dollar I spent on my own happiness was a dollar stolen from their future financial security. "Tyler has student loans," Sarah continued. "Marcus is trying to save for his daughter's college tuition. Diane's husband just got laid off. We all have real financial pressures. And meanwhile, you're buying sculptures and pottery wheels like money doesn't matter. It feels selfish." Selfish. That was the word that stayed with me long after the conversation ended. I was being selfish for spending my own money on things that brought me joy. I was being selfish for not preserving every dollar for people who had never contributed to earning it. I was being selfish for living my life according to my own values rather than their expectations. That night, I sat in my living room surrounded by the objects they found so objectionable: my pottery, my art, my carefully chosen furniture, and I realized something that should have been obvious from the beginning. Their criticism wasn't about my financial security at all. It was about their own financial expectations. They had spent years assuming that my money would eventually become their money, and every purchase I made reduced the size of their anticipated inheritance. They saw my savings account not as the result of my decades of hard work and careful planning, but as a family resource that I was temporarily managing. My spending wasn't wasteful in any objective sense. It was wasteful specifically because it reduced their future windfall. The sculpture arrived the following week. The installation team spent an entire day getting the lighting and positioning exactly right, and when they were finished, emergence dominated my living room in the most wonderful way. The bronze figure seemed to glow in the carefully placed spotlights, and the sense of movement and transformation that had attracted me to the piece was even more powerful in my own space. I stood looking at it that evening, remembering Sarah's words about selfishness, and I realized she was absolutely right about one thing. I was being selfish. I was choosing my own happiness over their financial expectations. I was prioritizing my own life over their inheritance plans. And I was about to become much more selfish than they could possibly imagine. The intervention came disguised as a family dinner. Diane called 3 days after the sculpture installation, her voice unusually bright and cheerful. "I was thinking we should all get together this Sunday," she said. "It's been too long since we've had the whole family in one place. Why don't you host? Everyone loves seeing your house, and it would be nice to catch up properly." Something in her tone made me suspicious, but I agreed. I spent Saturday shopping for ingredients, planning a menu that would accommodate everyone's dietary preferences and restrictions. I made Marcus's favorite lasagna, Tyler's beloved garlic bread, and Sarah's requested tiramisu. I bought good wine, fresh flowers for the table, and even picked up the artisanal cheese that Diane always raved about when we went to restaurants. Sunday arrived gray and drizzly, typical March weather in Portland. I spent the morning cooking, setting the table with my good china, and arranging the living room so that my new sculpture would be well lit but not overwhelming. I even moved some of my pottery pieces to less prominent positions, thinking perhaps a more subtle display might prevent the kind of comments that had dominated our recent conversations. They arrived within minutes of each other, clearly coordinated. Marcus came with his wife Jennifer and their teenage daughter Emma. Tyler brought his girlfriend Samantha, a serious young woman who worked in finance and rarely spoke unless asked direct questions. Sarah had driven up from Denver specifically for this dinner, which should have been my first clue that something unusual was planned. The conversation during dinner was carefully neutral. They asked about my pottery classes, complimented the food, and made polite observations about the changes I'd made to the house. No one mentioned the sculpture directly, though I caught Tyler staring at it several times with an expression I couldn't quite read. It was only after we'd finished dessert and moved to the living room that their real purpose became clear. "Andrea," Diane began, settling into the armchair closest to where I was sitting, "we wanted to talk to you about something important. We've all been thinking about our conversation last week, and we're concerned." The word "we" hung in the air like a declaration. This wasn't a casual family gathering. It was a planned confrontation. I looked around the room and saw the same expression on every face, a mixture of determination and discomfort that told me they had rehearsed this moment. "We love you," Sarah added quickly, "and we want what's best for you. But your spending lately, it's not sustainable, it's not responsible, and we think you might not realize how it looks from the outside." Jennifer, who rarely involved herself in family financial discussions, leaned forward. "Andrea, Marcus told me about the sculpture. $25,000 is a lot of money. That's Emma's college fund for next year. That's our entire emergency savings account." I started to point out that their financial situations had nothing to do with my purchases, but Tyler interrupted. "That's exactly the problem, Aunt Andrea. You're making these huge expenditures in isolation, without considering how they affect the family as a whole." How do they affect the family? I asked, though I was beginning to understand exactly where this conversation was heading. The room went quiet for a moment. They exchanged glances, each waiting for someone else to say what they were all thinking. Finally, Marcus cleared his throat. Look, Andrea, we need to be honest here. You're single, you don't have kids, and you're not getting any younger. When something happens to you, and we hope it won't be for many years, but when it does, your assets are going to be distributed among the family. That money is going to help pay for Emma's education, it's going to help Tyler start his business, it's going to help all of us with our financial goals. But every dollar you spend on these hobbies and art pieces is a dollar that won't be there when we need it, Diane continued. You're essentially spending our inheritance. There it was, the conversation I had been expecting ever since Sarah's phone call, but hearing it stated so baldly still took my breath away. They weren't concerned about my financial security or my future well-being. They were concerned about the erosion of their expected windfall. Your inheritance? I repeated, making sure I had heard correctly. Well, yes, Tyler said, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. I mean, who else would get it? You don't have any other family, and we're your closest relatives. It's not like the money is going to disappear when you die, it's going to come to us. So when you spend it on things like expensive sculptures, you're basically taking money out of our pockets. I looked around the room at these people I had loved, had shared holidays with, had supported through various crises over the years. Tyler, whose college tuition I had helped pay when his parents were struggling. Sarah, whose divorce lawyer I had quietly funded when her ex-husband tried to hide assets. Marcus, whose construction business I had helped finance during the 2008 recession. Diane, whose real estate license fees and continuing education I had covered when she was starting her career. Kwamen. None of them mentioned these past gifts. None of them acknowledged that I had already given them far more than most people ever receive from their families. In their minds, those had been loans against their future inheritance, or perhaps just down payments on what they were owed. Let me understand this correctly, I said slowly. You're upset because I'm spending my own money I earned through 32 years of work, on things that bring me happiness, because doing so reduces the amount you'll inherit when I die. It's not about being upset, Jennifer said defensively. It's about being practical. You could live for another 30 years, but you could also have a heart attack next month. None of us know what the future holds. What we do know is that you're spending money at an unsustainable rate on things that don't provide any real value. Real value to whom? I asked. To anyone, Tyler answered. A sculpture doesn't pay dividends. Pottery classes don't appreciate in value. You're converting liquid assets into depreciating decorative objects. From any rational financial perspective, it's a losing proposition. Samantha, who had been silent throughout the conversation, finally spoke up. I've actually run some calculations, she said, pulling out her phone. Based on your current spending patterns, you're depleting your assets at approximately 4% annually above normal living expenses. If that rate continues, you'll have reduced your net worth by 35 to 40% over the next decade, even accounting for investment growth. She had been calculating my net worth. They had all been calculating my net worth, tracking my spending, projecting their inheritance like it was a pension fund they were waiting to collect. The solution is simple, Marcus said. You just need to establish a budget for discretionary spending and stick to it. Maybe set aside $5,000 a year for hobbies and personal purchases. That's still generous, but it's reasonable. It lets you enjoy yourself without being irresponsible. $5,000 a year. Less than half of what I had spent on the sculpture alone. They wanted me to limit my annual discretionary spending to an amount that wouldn't significantly impact their anticipated inheritance. What if I don't want to establish such a budget? I asked. Then you're being selfish, Diane said bluntly. You're prioritizing temporary pleasures over your family's financial security. You're acting like this money belongs only to you, when the reality is that it's going to benefit all of us eventually. The question is whether there's going to be anything left to benefit anyone. Emma, who had been silent throughout the conversation, finally spoke. Grandpa Andrea, she said. She had called me that since she was little, a play on my name that I had always found endearing. I don't really understand all this money stuff, but I wanted to ask you something. Are you happy? Like, do all these art things and pottery classes make you actually happy? The question caught everyone off guard. The adults had been so focused on dollars and percentages that they had forgotten to consider whether my spending was actually improving my life. Yes, I said, looking directly at Emma. They make me very happy, happier than I've been in years. Then I don't understand why everyone's so upset, she said, with the devastating logic of a 16-year-old. If it's your money and it makes you happy, why does it matter what you spend it on? The room fell silent. Tyler started to say something about financial responsibility, but Emma cut him off. I mean, you guys are basically telling her she can't be happy with her own money because you want it later, right? That seems kind of mean. Out of the mouths of babes. Emma had summarized the entire situation with a clarity that none of the adults were willing to acknowledge. It's more complicated than that, sweetheart, Jennifer said gently. Is it? Emma asked. Because it sounds pretty simple to me. Grandpa Andrea worked for like 30 years to earn this money. And now you're all mad because she's spending it on things she likes instead of saving it for you. That doesn't seem fair. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. Emma, you don't understand how family finances work. I understand that it's her money, Emma replied stubbornly. And I understand that you're all being really rude about it. The intervention was not going according to their plan. They had expected me to be defensive, apologetic, perhaps even grateful for their concern. They had not expected to be called out by a teenager for their transparent greed. Look, Sarah said, trying to regain control of the conversation. We're not trying to be controlling. We're trying to be realistic. Andrea, you've spent almost $100,000 in 3 years on hobbies. At this rate, you're going to blow through your entire savings, and then what? You'll end up depending on us for support, which puts financial pressure on all of our families. It was a clever argument, framing their desire to preserve their inheritance as protection against my potential future dependence. But it was also completely dishonest. They knew as well as I did that my spending rate, while significant, was nowhere near enough to threaten my financial security. Even if I continued spending at this rate for the next 20 years, I would still have more than enough money to cover any reasonable end-of-life expenses. Actually, I said, I think this conversation has been very helpful. You've made your position very clear, and now I understand exactly how you view my money and my choices. They looked pleased, thinking I was conceding to their point of view. I'm going to need some time to think about everything you've said, I continued. This has given me a lot to consider about my financial planning and my family relationships. They exchanged satisfied glances. The intervention had been successful. They had made their point, established their expectations, and convinced me to reconsider my irresponsible spending habits. What they didn't realize was that I was considering something entirely different. I was considering what it meant to have a family that viewed my happiness as an obstacle to their financial goals. I was considering what it meant to be surrounded by people who had already divided up my assets in their minds. I was considering what I wanted my legacy to be, and whether these people deserved to benefit from a lifetime of work they had just told me was essentially theirs anyway. As they gathered their coats and said their goodbyes, each of them hugged me warmly and told me they loved me. Tyler patted my shoulder and said he was glad we could have an honest conversation. Sarah squeezed my hand and said she hoped I would think seriously about what they had discussed. Only Emma seemed to sense that something had changed. As she hugged me goodbye, she whispered, "I'm sorry they were so mean to you, Grandpa Andrea. Your sculpture is really beautiful." After they left, I stood in my living room looking at Emergence, the bronze figure breaking free from her constraints, reaching towards something better. For the first time since I had bought the piece, I truly understood what the artist had been trying to capture. Sometimes emergence requires breaking free from things that seem protective, but are actually constraining. Sometimes the people who claim to love you are the ones you need to escape from. Weird. I spent that evening making a different kind of list than usual. Not a list of things I wanted to buy, or experiences I wanted to have, but a list of things I needed to protect. My assets, my autonomy, my right to spend my own money according to my own values. And by the time I went to bed that night, I had the beginning of a plan. The wake-up call came in the form of a certified letter that arrived on a Wednesday morning, exactly 1 week after the family dinner. I was in my studio, working on a series of bowls inspired by the ocean waves I remembered from childhood vacations, when I heard the postal truck pull into my driveway. The driver handed me an envelope that required my signature, and the return address made my stomach drop. Thornton, Michaels and Associates, attorneys at law. Inside was a letter from a law firm I had never heard of, written on behalf of my family. The language was formal and cold, but the message was unmistakable. They were requesting that I undergo a psychological evaluation to determine my mental competency regarding financial decision-making. The letter cited my erratic spending patterns and concerning behavioral changes as evidence that I might be suffering from early-stage dementia or other cognitive impairment that was affecting my judgment. My hands shook as I read the document. They were trying to have me declared mentally incompetent so they could gain control of my finances. The letter mentioned specific purchases, the sculpture, my pottery equipment, the furniture, as evidence of irrational decision-making inconsistent with her previously conservative financial management style. But what stunned me most was the detailed financial information included in the letter. They had somehow obtained copies of my bank statements, investment account summaries, and property records. The letter included charts showing my spending patterns over the past 3 years, with my art and hobby purchases highlighted in red as, quote, concerning expenditures. They had been investigating me like I was a criminal, building a case to strip away my autonomy. I called my own attorney immediately. Rebecca Chen had handled my estate planning for the past decade, and she was the only person outside of my financial advisor who had a complete picture of my assets and planning. When I read her the letter over the phone, her response was swift and sharp. "This is harassment," she said without hesitation, "and it's based on completely false premises. Andrea, I've known you for 10 years. I've watched you make careful, considered decisions about your finances. Your spending is well within your means, and there's absolutely nothing in your behavior that suggests cognitive impairment." She explained that my family would need substantial evidence to pursue a competency hearing, and that casual spending on art and hobbies wouldn't meet that threshold. But she also warned me that the process itself could be damaging, expensive, and emotionally devastating, even if they ultimately lost. "The real question," Rebecca said, "is why they're doing this now. Has something changed in your family dynamics? Have they expressed concern about inheritance issues?" I told her about the dinner, about their explicit statements regarding their inheritance, about their demand that I limit my spending to preserve their windfall. Rebecca listened quietly, occasionally making notes, and when I finished, she sighed deeply. "I see this more often than I'd like to admit," she said. "Adult children or relatives who start viewing an elderly family member's assets as their own long before that person has died. It's a form of financial abuse, even when it's dressed up as concern for your welfare." Financial abuse. The term hit me like a physical blow. I had always thought of abuse as something that happened to other people, vulnerable people, people who didn't have my education or resources. But here I was, being systematically pressured, and now legally threatened, because I had chosen to spend my own money on my own happiness. Rebecca recommended that I document everything, save all communications from family members, keep detailed records of my spending and the reasoning behind it, and consider adjusting my estate planning to protect against future challenges. But most importantly, she suggested that I have a comprehensive cognitive evaluation done by a geriatric psychiatrist of my own choosing, creating an official record of my mental competency that would make any future challenges much more difficult. I made the appointment that afternoon with Dr. Sarah Martinez, a geriatrician who specialized in cognitive assessment. The evaluation was scheduled for the following week, but Dr. Martinez was willing to speak with me immediately about the situation I was facing. "Unfortunately, this is becoming increasingly common," she told me during our phone consultation. "Family members who become impatient about inheritance and start viewing normal aging or lifestyle changes as signs of incompetence. The fact that you're proactively seeking evaluation actually suggests the opposite of what they're claiming." That evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went through my entire financial portfolio with a fine-tooth comb, calculating exactly how much I had spent on my hobbies and art collection, and what percentage of my total assets those purchases represented. I wanted concrete numbers to counter their emotional arguments. The results were even more favorable than I had expected. Over the past 3 years, I had spent approximately $94,000 on art, pottery equipment, classes, and related expenses. That sounded like a significant amount until I compared it to my total net worth of $2.3 million. My irresponsible spending represented roughly 4% of my assets, less than the amount most financial advisors recommend keeping in cash for emergencies. More importantly, my investment accounts had grown by $180,000 during the same period, meaning that even after my art purchases, my net worth had increased. I was spending less than my money was earning. The idea that I was depleting my assets or threatening my financial security was completely false. But as I sat at my kitchen table surrounded by financial statements and calculations, I realized that the facts didn't matter to my family. They weren't concerned about my actual financial security. They were concerned about the size of their expected inheritance. In their minds, any money I spent was money stolen from them, regardless of whether I could afford it. The phone rang as I was putting away the documents. It was Tyler, and his voice had a smugness that made my skin crawl. "Hi, Aunt Andrea," he said. "I just wanted to check in and see how you're doing. I know last week's conversation was pretty intense, but I hope you've had time to think about what we discussed." I told him I had indeed been thinking about our conversation and its implications. "Good," he said, "because I wanted you to know that we're not trying to be controlling or anything. We just want to make sure you're making decisions that are in your best interest. And honestly, some of your recent choices have been concerning." "Concerning to whom?" I asked. "Well, to all of us, obviously. When family members start behaving erratically with money, it's usually a sign that something else is going on. Sometimes people don't realize when they're not thinking as clearly as they used to." He was fishing, trying to get me to admit to confusion or memory problems that could support their competency challenge. But his condescending tone had the opposite effect. It crystallized my anger into something cold and focused. "Tyler," I said carefully, "are you suggesting that I'm mentally impaired?" "I'm not suggesting anything," he said quickly. "I'm just saying that dramatic changes in spending patterns can be a warning sign. We care about you, and we want to make sure you're getting the support you need." "What kind of support are we talking about?" "Well, maybe having someone help you manage your finances. Someone who could provide oversight and make sure you're not making impulse purchases that you might regret later. It doesn't have to be a big deal, just someone to help you stay on track. Someone to help me manage my finances. Someone to provide oversight." They wanted a guardian or conservator who could control my spending and preserve their inheritance. They were trying to manipulate me into voluntarily giving up my financial autonomy. "That's an interesting suggestion," I said. "Who did you have in mind for this oversight role?" "Well, it would probably make sense for someone in the family to take that on. Someone who understands your situation and has your best interests at heart. I've got a business background, so I'd be happy to help if you think that would be useful." There it was. Tyler wanted to be appointed as my financial guardian, giving him legal control over my spending while preserving the maximum amount for his eventual inheritance. The audacity was breathtaking. "Let me think about that," I said. "Of course, take your time. But Andrea, I hope you understand that we're only suggesting this because we love you. We don't want to see you make decisions that you'll regret, or that might leave you in a difficult position later." After I hung up, I sat in my living room looking at my art collection, the pieces they wanted me to stop buying, the sculptures and paintings that brought me daily joy, the tangible evidence of my freedom to make my own choices. Each piece represented not just aesthetic pleasure but autonomy, the right to spend my money according to my own values rather than their expectations. That night, I called Rebecca Chen at her home number, something I had never done before. "I need to change my estate plan," I told her, completely. She listened as I explained Tyler's phone call, their apparent coordination with an attorney, and their obvious intention to gain control of my finances through legal means. "Rebecca, they're not going to stop. They've convinced themselves that my money belongs to them and they're willing to destroy my autonomy to get it. I need to protect myself, and I need to send a message that their behavior has consequences." "What kind of message are you thinking about?" she asked. "I want to set up a trust that puts my assets completely beyond their reach, and I want to make it clear that their attempts to control my spending have disqualified them from any inheritance." Rebecca was quiet for a long moment. "Andrea, that's a significant step. It will effectively disinherit your entire family. Are you sure that's what you want? I looked around my living room at the beautiful objects I had chosen, the evidence of a life lived according to my own preferences rather than other people's expectations. I thought about Emma, the only family member who had defended my right to spend my own money on my own happiness. I thought about the charities I supported, the artists whose work I collected, the pottery students who might benefit from scholarships. I'm sure, I said. They made their choice when they decided my happiness was less important than their inheritance. Now I'm making mine. The next morning, I began the process of completely restructuring my financial life. Not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. They had forced me to choose between my autonomy and their expectations, and the choice was easier than I had anticipated. If they wanted to treat my money as if it already belonged to them, they were about to learn how wrong they were. The cognitive evaluation with Dr. Martinez was scheduled for a Friday morning, but I arrived at her office 45 minutes early. I had spent the previous 3 days preparing documentation that would demonstrate not just my mental competency, but my systematic approach to financial planning. I brought 10 years of investment statements, detailed budgets showing my spending patterns, and a portfolio analysis that my financial advisor had prepared specifically for this meeting. Dr. Martinez was a woman in her early 60s with silver hair and kind eyes that missed nothing. Her office was warm and comfortable, filled with plants and soft lighting that felt more like a living room than a medical facility. She spent the first 30 minutes simply talking with me about my background, my career, my retirement plans, and my current interests. "Tell me about your pottery," she said, and I found myself relaxing as I described the meditative quality of working with clay, the satisfaction of creating something beautiful with my hands, the community I had found among other ceramicists. She asked thoughtful questions about technique, about the artists who inspired me, about my long-term goals for my work. Then she moved on to my art collection. I showed her photos of my pieces on my phone, explaining why each one spoke to me, how I had researched the artists, what criteria I used for making purchases. She seemed genuinely interested in Elena Vasquez's work, asking about the sculptor's background and artistic evolution. "Your family is concerned about your spending on these interests," she said finally. "Can you help me understand your decision-making process?" I pulled out the financial analysis I had prepared. "Doctor, I've spent approximately 4% of my net worth on art and hobbies over the past 3 years. During that same period, my investments have grown by 8% annually. I'm spending less than I'm earning, even accounting for my new interests." She reviewed my documents carefully, asking questions about my investment strategy, my long-term care planning, and my understanding of market risks. We spent an hour going through various financial scenarios, discussing how I would handle market downturns, medical emergencies, or changes in my housing needs. The formal cognitive testing took another 2 hours. Memory tests, problem-solving exercises, attention and concentration assessments, and evaluations of my executive function. I found the tests engaging rather than stressful. They reminded me of the complex projects I had managed during my career, requiring the same kind of systematic thinking and attention to detail. When we finished, Dr. Martinez reviewed my results immediately. "Andrea, I want to be very clear about my findings. Your cognitive function is not just normal for your age. It's exceptional. Your memory, reasoning ability, and decision-making capacity are all well above average. There is absolutely no evidence of any impairment that would affect your ability to manage your finances." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "What I am seeing is evidence of what we call late-life liberation, the psychological freedom that often comes when people retire and finally have the resources to pursue interests they've deferred for decades. This is a healthy development, not a concerning one." I asked her to put everything in writing, creating an official record that could counter any future competency challenges. She agreed immediately, saying she would have a comprehensive report ready by Monday that documented both my test results and her professional opinion about my mental capacity. "Andrea," she said as I was preparing to leave, "I need to tell you something as both a physician and someone who has seen this situation before. What your family is doing, Questioning your competency because they don't approve of your spending choices is a form of elder abuse. You have every right to spend your money on things that bring you joy, and their attempts to control that through legal intimidation are deeply inappropriate. Her words gave me the final piece of clarity I needed. This wasn't a family disagreement about money. It was an attempt to strip away my fundamental rights as an autonomous adult. And it required a response that was equally decisive. Be so dolls. I spent that weekend implementing the first phase of my new financial strategy. Rebecca had worked quickly to draft the documents we needed, and by Sunday evening I had signed papers establishing the Andrea Wilson Foundation, a private charitable trust that would ultimately receive the bulk of my assets. The foundation had a clear mission: supporting arts education for underserved communities, providing scholarships for pottery and ceramics programs, and purchasing art from emerging artists to donate to public spaces. Everything I was passionate about, everything my family had criticized as wasteful, would become my legacy. But the foundation was just the beginning. I also established a revocable living trust that gave me complete control over my assets during my lifetime, while ensuring they would be distributed according to my wishes after my death. The trust included specific language protecting against competency challenges and requiring extraordinary evidence to modify its terms. Most importantly, I changed the beneficiaries on all my accounts. My family members, who had spent months calculating their expected inheritance, would receive exactly what they deserved for their behavior. Nothing. Well, not quite nothing. I made one exception. Emma, my 16-year-old great-niece who had been the only one to defend my choices, would receive a substantial education fund that would cover her college expenses and graduate school if she chose to pursue it. The fund was protected in such a way that her parents couldn't access or control it. Rebecca had also helped me draft what she called an ethical will, a document explaining my decisions for anyone who might question them in the future. I spent Sunday afternoon writing a detailed account of my family's behavior, their attempts to control my spending, and their threat of legal action to gain control of my finances. The document would be sealed with my estate papers, creating a permanent record of why I had chosen to disinherit them. Abia. Monday morning brought the call I had been expecting. Marcus phoned while I was in my studio, his voice tight with frustration. "Andrea, we need to talk. I got a call from Tom Thornton, the lawyer we consulted about the competency evaluation. He says you've been to see a psychiatrist on your own, and that she's refusing to cooperate with our request for an independent assessment." "Dr. Martinez isn't refusing to cooperate," I said calmly. "She's following proper medical protocols. She evaluated me thoroughly and found no evidence of cognitive impairment. If you want an independent assessment, you'll need to petition the court and prove that one is necessary." "Damn it, Andrea, why are you being so difficult about this? We're trying to help you." "Help me do what, exactly?" "Help you avoid making decisions you'll regret. Help you preserve your financial security. Help you preserve your inheritance," I interrupted. "Let's be honest about what this is really about." Marcus went quiet for a moment. "Fine," he said finally. "Yes, we're concerned about the inheritance. We're concerned that you're going to spend it all on pottery classes and sculptures, and there won't be anything left for the people who actually need it." "People who actually need it?" "Yes, Tyler has student loans. Emma needs college money. Diane's husband is still unemployed. Sarah's going through a rough patch financially. We all have real expenses, real needs. And meanwhile, you're spending money like it's going out of style." "Marcus, I need to ask you something directly. When did my money become your money? It's not about, when did my savings account become your college fund? When did my investment portfolio become your emergency fund? When did my financial security become less important than your financial expectations?" He started to respond, but I continued. "Because that's what you're really saying. You're saying that my happiness matters less than your financial planning. You're saying that I should limit my joy to preserve your windfall." "That's not what we're saying." "Then what are you saying? Because it sounds to me like you've already spent my money in your minds, and now you're angry that I'm spending it in reality." Marcus was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, harder, more honest. "Look, Andrea, I'm going to level with you. Yeah, we've been counting on that money. We've made plans based on it. Tyler's business idea, Emma's education, all of it. We factored in the inheritance when we made those decisions. And that's my problem, how? Because you're family. Because when you die, that money is going to come to us anyway. Because spending it all on yourself it's selfish. There it was again. Selfish. The word they kept using to describe my choice to spend my own money on my own life. Marcus, I said quietly, I want you to listen to me very carefully. I have never promised you money. I have never told you to make plans based on my assets. I have never agreed to limit my spending to preserve your inheritance. The fact that you've been counting on money that isn't yours is not my responsibility. But it's family money. No, it's not. It's my money. I earned it. I saved it. I invested it. And I have every right to spend it however I choose, whether that's on art or pottery or anything else that brings me happiness. Even if it means there's nothing left for us. I paused, thinking about the foundation documents I had signed, about the new will that would ensure my money went to causes I cared about rather than people who felt entitled to it. Marcus, let me ask you something. If I died tomorrow, would you be sad because you lost me or because you lost your inheritance? The silence that followed answered my question more clearly than any words could have. I think we're done with this conversation, I said finally. And I think we're done with any conversations about my finances or my spending. If you're concerned about your own financial security, I suggest you focus on earning your own money rather than waiting for mine. I hung up before he could respond. That afternoon, I made another round of purchases that would have sent my family into fits of rage if they had known about them. I bought a kiln-forming glass workshop course that cost $3,000. I commissioned a custom piece from a local metalworker for my garden. I purchased a small painting from an artist whose work I had been following for months. Each purchase felt like an act of rebellion, a declaration that my money was mine to spend, my life was mine to live, and my happiness was worth more than their inheritance expectations. But more than that, each purchase felt like freedom, the freedom to make choices without accounting to people who valued my money more than my autonomy, the freedom to support artists and craftspeople whose work brought beauty into the world, the freedom to spend my final decades pursuing joy, rather than preserving wealth for people who had shown me exactly how little my well-being mattered to them. They had called my spending wasteful, but they had wasted something far more valuable, the relationship with someone who had loved them unconditionally and supported them generously for decades. Now they would discover exactly how much that waste was going to cost them. Halem. The silence lasted exactly 4 days. Halem. After my conversation with Marcus, none of my family members called, texted, or attempted any contact. It was an eerie quiet, the kind that feels heavy with impending storm. I used those 4 days productively, meeting with my financial advisor to ensure all account beneficiaries had been updated, consulting with Rebecca about additional protective measures, and starting the process of moving some assets into the foundation's name. On Thursday afternoon, while I was glazing a set of dinner plates in my studio, I heard multiple car doors slamming in my driveway simultaneously. Through the window, I saw Tyler's silver BMW, Diane's white SUV, and Marcus's pickup truck parked in a semicircle, as if they were staging a siege rather than a family visit. They didn't knock. Tyler used the spare key I had given him years earlier for emergencies, and suddenly my house was full of angry voices and accusatory gestures. I found them in my living room, arranged like a tribunal, with Tyler pacing behind the others who had seated themselves on my furniture like they owned it. "We know what you've been doing," Diane announced without preamble. "Tyler's girlfriend works at the bank. She saw the account changes." I remained standing in the doorway, still wearing my pottery apron, my hands dusty with clay. "Hello to you too, Diane. Please, make yourselves at home." "Cut the sarcasm, Andrea," Marcus said. "This is serious. You've been moving money around, changing beneficiaries, setting up some kind of trust. What exactly are you trying to pull here?" Tyler stopped pacing and turned to face me directly. "Samantha couldn't give me details because of privacy laws, but she could confirm that you've made major changes to your accounts. Changes that happened right after our conversation about financial oversight." I walked into the room and sat down in my favorite chair, the one positioned to best view my sculpture collection. Yes, I've made some changes to my financial arrangements. I'm surprised you think that's any of your business. Of course it's our business, Diane said, her voice rising. We're your family. We're your beneficiaries. You can't just change things without discussing it with us first. Actually, I can, I said calmly. It's my money, and I can leave it to whoever I choose. Last time I checked, there was no law requiring me to get permission from potential heirs before making estate planning decisions. Sarah, who had driven up from Denver again specifically for this confrontation, leaned forward. Andrea, please tell me you haven't done something drastic. Please tell me you haven't let your anger about our intervention make you do something you'll regret. I'm not angry, I said, which was true. I had moved beyond anger into something cleaner and more purposeful. I'm protecting myself and my assets from people who have made it clear they feel entitled to control both. Tyler pulled out his phone and started scrolling through something. I did some research on elder financial abuse. Did you know that lawyers can face serious consequences for helping elderly clients make irrational financial decisions when they're under emotional duress? The threat was subtle but unmistakable. He was suggesting that my attorney might be liable for helping me change my estate plan, implying that my decisions were the result of mental instability rather than rational choice. Tyler, I said, are you threatening to report my attorney to the Bar Association? I'm just saying that there are protections in place for seniors who might be making decisions they don't fully understand. Decisions that go against their own best interests. Marcus jumped in. Look, we get it. You're upset about the competency evaluation. Maybe we went about that the wrong way. But this, completely changing your estate plan out of spite, this is exactly the kind of erratic behavior that proves our point. Erratic behavior? I repeated. Protecting my assets from people who have explicitly told me they consider those assets to be theirs already? That's erratic? You're taking money away from your own family, Diane said, and for the first time, her voice cracked with what might have been genuine emotion. Money that could help Emma go to college. Money that could help Tyler start his business. Money that could help all of us build better lives. You're punishing us for caring about you. I'm not punishing you for caring about me, I said. I'm protecting myself from people who care more about my money than my autonomy. There is a difference. Sarah stood up abruptly and began pacing to the window. This is insane. We had one conversation, one honest conversation about financial responsibility, and now you're acting like we're enemies. We're not trying to steal from you, Andrea. We're trying to help you make better decisions. Better for whom? Better for everyone. Better for you, because you won't end up broke in a nursing home. Better for us, because we'll be able to help you if you need it, instead of watching you spend yourself into poverty. I looked around at these people I had known and loved for decades, and I realized that we were speaking entirely different languages. In their minds, their concern about my spending was genuine care for my welfare. They couldn't see or refused to acknowledge that their care was indistinguishable from financial control. Let me ask you something, I said. If I promised right now to stop buying art, to stop taking pottery classes, to limit my discretionary spending to whatever amount you consider reasonable, would you still be concerned about my competency? They exchanged glances. Tyler was the first to answer. Well, that would certainly address our main concerns. So this isn't really about my mental capacity at all. It's about my spending choices. You want me declared incompetent not because I can't make rational decisions, but because I'm making rational decisions you don't like. That's not, Diane started. That's exactly what it is, I interrupted. You want legal control over my finances, so you can prevent me from spending money on things that don't benefit you. That's not concern for my welfare, that's concern for your inheritance. Marcus stood up, his face flushed with anger. Fine, you want us to be completely honest? Yes, we're concerned about the inheritance. Yes, we think you're being selfish with money that's going to come to us eventually anyway. Yes, we think you should consider our needs when you make these expensive purchases. Finally, I said, finally, some honesty. But that doesn't make us wrong, he continued. Just because we have a financial interest doesn't mean our concerns aren't valid. You are spending money at an unsustainable rate on things that have no practical value. You are making decisions that will leave less for the people who depend on you. People who depend on me? I stood up now, my own voice rising. Marcus, you're a successful contractor with your own business. Diane, you're a real estate agent in one of the hottest markets in the country. Tyler, you're a college graduate with an MBA. Sarah, you're a marketing executive. Exactly how do any of you depend on me? It's not about dependence, Tyler said. It's about family responsibility. When you have assets like yours, those assets don't exist in a vacuum. They're part of the family's financial ecosystem. Family financial ecosystem? I repeated. Is that what we're calling inheritance expectations now? Diane moved closer to me, her voice dropping to the tone she probably used with difficult real estate clients. Andrea, I'm going to be very direct with you. We've talked to 3 different attorneys about this situation. The consensus is that your recent behavior, the sudden increase in spending, the dramatic changes to your estate plan, the refusal to accept family input on financial decisions, all of that could be evidence of diminished capacity. Evidence to whom? To a court. If we petition for guardianship based on financial incapacity, the court will look at patterns of behavior that suggest you're no longer able to make rational decisions about money. And honey, spending $25,000 on a sculpture after your family has expressed concerns about your financial management? That's going to look pretty irrational to a judge. The threat was now explicit. They weren't just considering legal action, they were planning it. And they were confident enough in their case to use it as leverage in this conversation. I see, I said quietly. So now we've moved from, we're concerned about you, to we're going to have you declared incompetent if you don't do what we want. Is that an accurate summary? We don't want to go to court, Sarah said quickly. But if you're not willing to listen to reason, if you're not willing to consider how your actions affect the rest of us, then we might not have a choice. You always have a choice, I said. You could choose to respect my autonomy. You could choose to trust that I'm capable of managing my own finances. You could choose to be happy that I'm finally able to pursue interests that bring me joy. Or you could choose to compromise, Tyler said. You could agree to reasonable oversight, reasonable limits on discretionary spending, reasonable protection for the family's interests. The family's interests, I repeated. Not my interests, the family's interests. I walked over to my sculpture, Emergence, and ran my hand along its bronze surface. The metal was cool and smooth, and I found the contact grounding. I want all of you to leave now, I said without turning around. Andrea? Diane started. I want you to leave my house, and I want you to think very carefully about what you've just told me. You've threatened to have me declared mentally incompetent, because I won't agree to let you control my spending. You've made it clear that you consider my money to be family property that I'm temporarily managing. You've told me that my happiness is less important than your financial expectations. I turned to face them. You've also made it clear that you're willing to destroy my autonomy and independence to get what you want. So I want you to leave, and I want you to think about whether that sounds like love to you. Tyler started to say something, but Marcus grabbed his arm. Come on, he said. We're done here. They filed out without another word, leaving behind an atmosphere of tension and broken relationships. Through the window, I watched them cluster in my driveway for several minutes, having what appeared to be an intense discussion before finally getting in their cars and driving away. That evening, I called Rebecca Chen again. They're definitely going to petition for guardianship, I told her. They've consulted multiple attorneys, and they're confident they can build a case based on my spending and my estate plan changes. Then we need to be ready, Rebecca said. The good news is that we have Dr. Martinez's evaluation proving your competency. The bad news is that guardianship proceedings can be expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally devastating even when you win. What do you recommend? I recommend we get ahead of this. I want to file a preemptive action documenting their harassment and their threats to pursue guardianship for financial gain. If we can establish a pattern of attempted financial exploitation, it becomes much harder for them to claim they're acting in your best interests. That night, I sat in my living room surrounded by the art they found so objectionable, and I made a decision that surprised even me. If they wanted to go to war over my money, they were going to discover that I had weapons they didn't know about. Nudista hilar rejection my, and I was prepared to use all of them. Das satiksta hilar. The envelope arrived on a Monday morning, delivered by a process server, who rang my doorbell at precisely 8 a.m. Inside was a petition for guardianship, filed by Marcus Wilson on behalf of himself and other concerned family members. The document was thick, 37 pages of legal arguments, financial records, and sworn statements painting me as a mentally deteriorating woman whose erratic spending patterns and isolation from family counsel proved I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs. They had been thorough. The petition included bank statements highlighting my art purchases in red, photographs of my pottery studio with estimated equipment costs, and even a statement from a neighbor claiming I had seemed confused and agitated during recent conversations. They had built their case methodically, gathering evidence and witness statements over weeks while pretending to be concerned family members. But they had made one crucial mistake. They had filed their petition 3 days after Rebecca and I had filed our preemptive action, documenting their harassment and financial exploitation attempts. Our filing included recordings of several phone conversations. Oregon is a one-party consent state, so I had been legally recording every family interaction since Tyler's first threatening call. We had timestamps, transcripts, and sworn testimony from Dr. Martinez about my cognitive evaluation. Most damaging to their case was Tyler's recorded statement that they had, quote, been counting on that money and had, quote, made plans based on the inheritance. Rebecca had highlighted this in our counterfiling as clear evidence that their guardianship petition was motivated by financial gain rather than concern for my welfare. The court date was set for 6 weeks out, but the real battle began immediately. My phone started ringing constantly, with calls from relatives I hadn't heard from in years, each one trying to gather information about my situation or to express their concern about my recent behavior. It became clear that my immediate family had launched a broader campaign, reaching out to extended relatives and family friends to build support for their position. My cousin Janet from Seattle called to tell me she was worried about reports of my increased spending. My former colleague Patricia phoned to say she'd heard I was having some difficulties and wanted to offer support. Even my elderly neighbor Mrs. Chen contacted me to ask if everything was all right, mentioning that Diane had stopped by to check on me and seemed very concerned about my well-being. Each conversation followed the same pattern: expressions of care and support, followed by gentle probing about my finances, my decision-making, and my relationship with my immediate family. It was a coordinated effort to gather statements that could be used to support their guardianship petition, disguised as friendly concern from people who cared about me. But their campaign had an unexpected consequence. It revealed the extent of their machinations to people who actually did care about me. Mrs. Chen, who had known me for 15 years, was disturbed enough by Diane's questions that she called to warn me about the visit. Patricia, my former colleague, was suspicious of the timing and nature of her contact from my family, especially since they had never shown interest in my welfare during my working years. Most importantly, their outreach campaign brought my situation to the attention of Emma's other grandparents, Jennifer's parents, the Hendersons, who had resources and legal connections of their own. When they learned that their granddaughter's college fund was potentially threatened by a guardianship proceeding aimed at controlling my assets, they immediately contacted their own attorney to explore options for protecting Emma's interests. The Hendersons' involvement changed the dynamics significantly. Their attorney, David Park, was a specialist in elder law with extensive experience in guardianship proceedings. After reviewing the case, he offered to work with Rebecca as co-counsel, bringing additional expertise and resources to my defense. This is one of the clearest cases of attempted financial exploitation I've seen, David told me during our first meeting. Your family's own recorded statements prove they're not acting in your best interests. They're acting in their own financial interests. That makes their guardianship petition not just baseless, but potentially fraudulent. David's strategy was aggressive and comprehensive. Rather than simply defending against their petition, he recommended that we file counterclaims for attempted financial exploitation, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We would seek not only to dismiss their guardianship petition, but to obtain a restraining order preventing them from interfering with my financial affairs. We're going to make this so expensive and legally risky for them that they'll withdraw their petition before it ever reaches trial, he explained. And we're going to create a legal record that will prevent them from ever attempting this kind of manipulation again. The discovery phase of the legal proceedings was devastating to their case. Under oath, during depositions, my family members were forced to admit that they had no evidence of cognitive impairment beyond their disapproval of my spending choices. They had to acknowledge that they had been planning their inheritance for years and had made financial decisions based on expectations about my assets. Most damaging was Tyler's deposition, where he admitted under questioning that his primary concern was preserving the family's, quote, financial legacy rather than my personal welfare. When asked directly whether he would still seek guardianship if I promised to leave my entire estate to charity, he hesitated long enough for his motivations to become crystal clear. Diane's deposition was equally problematic. She was forced to admit that she had approached my neighbors and former colleagues specifically to gather negative information about my behavior, and that she had misrepresented the purpose of these conversations. Her own words, recorded during our phone conversations, contradicted her sworn testimony about being motivated by concern for my well-being. The break in their case came when Samantha, Tyler's girlfriend who worked at the bank, was deposed about her role in providing information about my account changes. Under oath, she admitted that she had violated bank privacy policies by discussing my financial information with Tyler, and that she could be fired and face criminal charges for her actions. Faced with the possibility that their key source of financial information could be prosecuted for her cooperation, and realizing that their own recorded statements had undermined their credibility, my family's legal team began exploring settlement options. The settlement conference was held in a conference room at David Park's law firm on a rainy Thursday afternoon in May. My family sat on one side of a long table with their attorney, while I sat with Rebecca and David on the other side. The mediator was a retired judge who specialized in family disputes, and her opening remarks made it clear that she had reviewed the evidence and found my family's case problematic. "I'm going to be direct," Judge Morrison said. "The guardianship petition appears to be motivated primarily by the petitioner's financial interests rather than the respondent's welfare. The evidence of cognitive impairment is virtually non-existent, while the evidence of attempted financial manipulation is substantial." Marcus tried to interrupt, but their attorney quickly silenced him. The legal reality was clear. They were going to lose, and continuing to trial would only increase their financial exposure and legal liability. The settlement terms were straightforward. They would withdraw their guardianship petition and agree never to challenge my competency or interfere with my financial decisions again. They would pay my legal fees, which had exceeded $40,000. And they would sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement, preventing them from discussing my financial affairs with anyone outside the immediate family. In exchange, I agreed not to pursue criminal charges against Samantha for her privacy violations and not to seek additional damages for harassment and emotional distress. I also agreed to maintain Emma's education fund, ensuring that their legal overreach wouldn't impact her future opportunities. But the most significant part of the settlement wasn't written in any legal document. It was the moment when Marcus looked across the table and asked, "So what happens now? With the family, I mean." I met his eyes directly. "That depends on whether you've learned anything from this experience." "What do you mean?" "I mean, do you understand now that your behavior was wrong? Do you see that trying to control my finances was a form of abuse? Do you recognize that my money was never yours to claim?" The silence stretched for nearly a minute. Finally, Sarah spoke. "We were just trying to protect the family's interests." "Whose family?" I asked. "Because you certainly weren't protecting mine." Tyler cleared his throat. "Look, maybe we went about this the wrong way. Maybe we should have approached things differently." "Maybe?" David Park interjected. "You threatened to have an elderly family member declared mentally incompetent so you could control her finances. You violated her privacy, harassed her neighbors, and attempted to strip away her fundamental rights as an autonomous adult." "Maybe" is a rather weak acknowledgement of that behavior. Diane finally spoke, her voice smaller than I had ever heard it. "Andrea, we didn't mean for things to go this far. We really were concerned about you." "No," I said firmly. "You were concerned about your inheritance. There's a difference, and until you understand that difference, we don't have anything more to discuss." The papers were signed, the settlement was finalized, and my family filed out of the conference room without another word. I watched them leave, These people who had been such a central part of my life for so many years, and I felt something I hadn't expected: relief. For the first time in months, I was free from their judgment, their expectations, and their sense of entitlement to my life and assets. The legal settlement had accomplished more than just defeating their guardianship petition. It had severed the financial bonds that had allowed them to feel ownership over my choices. That evening, I sat in my living room with Emma, who had asked to visit after learning about the settlement. She was the only family member who had refused to participate in the guardianship proceedings, and the only one who had supported my right to spend my money as I chose. "Are you sad?" she asked, curled up in the chair next to mine. "About what?" "About the family. About how everything turned out." I considered the question carefully. "I'm sad about what they chose to become," I said finally. "But I'm not sad about protecting myself from people who valued my money more than my happiness." Emma nodded solemnly. "I'm glad you won." "We all won, actually. They just don't realize it yet." "What do you mean?" "I mean, they're free now to build their own wealth instead of waiting for mine. They're free to make their own financial decisions instead of trying to control mine. They just haven't figured out yet that freedom is better than entitlement." As I spoke the words, I realized they were true. The legal battle had freed all of us, them from their unhealthy fixation on my assets, and me from their attempts to control my autonomy. Whatever relationships emerged from this experience would be healthier, because they would be based on genuine care rather than financial expectations. But that was a conversation for another day. Tonight, I was simply grateful to be sitting in my own home, surrounded by art I had chosen and pottery I had made, with my autonomy intact and my future secured according to my own values rather than other people's expectations. The war was over, and I had won more than just a legal victory. I had won the right to live my life on my own terms. 6 months after the settlement, I stood in the main gallery of the Portland Art Museum, watching a crowd of young people examine the ceramic pieces displayed as part of the Emerging Voices exhibition. The Andrea Wilson Foundation had sponsored the show, which featured work from pottery students and emerging ceramicists from across the Pacific Northwest. Many of the artists were in their 20s and 30s, finally able to pursue their craft because foundation scholarships had covered their studio fees, equipment costs, and workshop tuition. Among the displayed pieces was a series of vessels by Maria Santos, a single mother from East Portland who had never been able to afford pottery classes until the Foundation's community outreach program identified her exceptional talent. Her work was stunning, organic forms that seemed to capture the movement of wind and water in clay. Standing next to her pieces was Maria herself, nervously explaining her techniques to a collector who was clearly interested in purchasing several pieces. "Are you the woman who made all this possible?" asked a voice behind me. I turned to find a man in his 60s with kind eyes and paint-stained fingers. He introduced himself as Robert Chen, Elena Vasquez's mentor, and a sculptor whose work I had admired for years. "I suppose I helped," I said, gesturing toward the exhibition, "but they made it possible themselves. I just removed some of the financial barriers." Robert smiled. "Elena told me about you. She said you were one of the first collectors to really understand her work, to see the meaning behind the forms rather than just buying art as an investment." We walked through the exhibition together, and he told me about his own journey as an artist, the decades of working restaurant jobs to pay for studio space, the constant struggle between creative passion and financial survival, the way money concerns had nearly ended his career before it truly began. "What you're doing with this foundation," he said, stopping in front of a series of sculptural bowls created by a recent high school graduate. "It's giving people the gift of time. Time to experiment, time to fail, time to discover what they're capable of creating." His words stayed with me as I drove home that evening. The gift of time. That's what my money had always represented. The time to pursue interests, without worrying about immediate practical returns. The freedom to explore creativity without calculating the cost-benefit ratio of every decision. My family had seen this as wasteful because they measured value only in financial terms. They couldn't understand that some investments pay dividends in joy, growth, and meaning rather than dollars. They had viewed my pottery classes and art purchases as frivolous expenses, when in reality, they were investments in my own transformation from a person who worked to live into a person who lived to create. The foundation had become an extension of that philosophy. Instead of preserving wealth for people who felt entitled to it, I was using it to create opportunities for people who would earn them through passion and dedication. Every scholarship funded was a young artist who wouldn't have to choose between rent money and studio fees. Every equipment grant was a potter who could focus on perfecting their craft instead of working extra jobs to afford a kiln. The transformation wasn't just in the lives the foundation touched, it was in my own life as well. Without the constant pressure of family judgment and financial oversight, my own artistic practice had flourished. I had moved beyond basic pottery techniques to experimental glazing methods, and my pieces were becoming more sophisticated and personal. I had even sold several pieces through a local gallery, though the money wasn't the point. The recognition was validation that my wasteful hobby had evolved into genuine artistic expression. But the most significant change was in my relationships. The legal settlement had created clear boundaries that protected me from further financial manipulation. But it had also forced me to confront which relationships in my life were based on genuine care and which were based on expectations of future benefit. Emma had become a regular visitor, stopping by after school to work on homework in my studio while I threw pots. She had started taking pottery classes herself, funded by the education account I had established for her, and she showed real talent for the craft. More importantly, she seemed to understand intuitively what her parents and uncle had never grasped, that the value of creating something beautiful with your own hands couldn't be measured in dollars. "Why do you think they got so angry about your money?" she asked one afternoon while centering clay on the wheel. "Because they were thinking about it wrong," I said, watching her hands guide the clay into a perfect cylinder. "They were thinking about money as something to accumulate and preserve, rather than something to use for creating the life you want." "But don't you need to save money for when you're old?" I laughed. "Emma, I am old. This is exactly when I should be spending money on things that make me happy." The whole point of saving was to eventually have the freedom to live according to my own values. She considered this as she pulled the clay up into the beginnings of a vase. "So they wanted you to keep saving forever? Even when you already had enough?" "They wanted me to keep saving until I died so they could inherit it. They never wanted me to actually enjoy the money I had worked my whole life to earn." "That seems really sad," she said. "For them, I mean. Like they were so focused on getting your money someday that they forgot to be happy with their own lives." Emma's perspective, delivered with the clarity that only teenagers possess, helped me understand something I had been struggling with since the settlement. My family's behavior hadn't just been greedy. It had been self-destructive. By fixating on my assets as their future security, they had neglected to build their own financial independence. By spending their emotional energy calculating their inheritance, they had failed to invest in their own growth and happiness. The Foundation's first annual report, published that fall, told a story that would have horrified my family. In 1 year, we had awarded 63 scholarships, funded 12 community pottery programs, purchased and donated 47 pieces of art to public spaces, and established 3 artist residency programs. The total expenditure was nearly $200,000, money that, in my family's accounting, should have been preserved for their eventual inheritance. But the report also told another story, one measured in human potential rather than dollars. Maria Santos had been accepted into a prestigious MFA program and offered a teaching assistantship that would support her family while she completed her degree. James Kim, a veteran who had found healing through ceramics after returning from deployment, had opened his own therapeutic pottery studio for other veterans dealing with PTSD. Sarah Martinez, no relation to my family, had used her foundation scholarship to develop a new glazing technique that was being adopted by ceramicists internationally. These were the real returns on investment: lives changed, talents developed, communities enriched. My money was generating dividends that my family could never have calculated, because they had never learned to measure value in anything other than financial terms. The anniversary of the legal settlement approached with no contact from my immediate family. There had been no birthday calls, no holiday cards, no attempts to rebuild relationships on healthier terms. They had made their choice, prioritizing their financial disappointment over any possibility of genuine reconciliation. I wasn't surprised, but I was saddened by their inability to see beyond their sense of entitlement. They could have chosen to be proud of what the foundation was accomplishing. They could have chosen to support my artistic development and celebrate my newfound creative fulfillment. They could have chosen to build relationships with me based on who I was rather than what I owned. Instead, they had chosen to nurse their grievances and maintain their distance, apparently preferring the role of victims of my selfishness to the more challenging work of examining their own attitudes and behaviors. But their absence had created space for new relationships based on mutual interests and genuine connection. I had become part of a community of artists, collectors, and arts advocates who valued creativity and supported each other's growth. I had developed friendships with people who cared about my work and my well-being without any expectation of financial benefit. Most importantly, I had developed a relationship with myself that wasn't mediated by other people's expectations or judgments. For the first time in my adult life, my choices were purely my own, not influenced by career demands, family pressure, or social expectations about how a woman my age should behave. On the one-year anniversary of the settlement, I sat in my studio working on a large sculptural piece inspired by the theme of emergence that had attracted me to Elena Vazquez's work. The piece was ambitious, larger and more complex than anything I had attempted before, and it represented everything I had learned about breaking free from constraints that limit growth. As I worked, shaping the clay with movements that had become second nature after years of practice, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. My family had called my spending wasteful, but they had been looking at the wrong kind of waste. The real waste would have been dying with money in the bank and songs unsung, art uncreated, potential unrealized. They had wanted me to preserve wealth for their benefit, but I had chosen to transform wealth into something far more valuable: the freedom to live authentically, to support causes I believed in, and to use my resources to create opportunities for others to flourish. The sculpture taking shape under my hands was still rough, but I could see its final form emerging from the clay. Like my own life, it required patience, skill, and the willingness to let go of preconceived notions about what it should become. The process couldn't be rushed, and the outcome couldn't be guaranteed, but the work itself was its own reward. As the late afternoon light slanted through my studio windows, illuminating the clay dust dancing in the air, I felt a deep sense of contentment that no amount of money could have purchased. This was what wealth was truly for, not to be hoarded or preserved, but to be transformed into the life you actually wanted to live. My family had accused me of wasting money, but I had discovered something they never understood. The only real waste is a life unlived, a passion unexplored, a gift unshared. Everything else, including their disappointment about their lost inheritance, was just the price of choosing joy over obligation, growth over stagnation, authenticity over approval. And that was a price I was proud to have paid. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.